What if the silence wasn't hurting you anymore? What if, for the first time, they were the ones sitting in the silence waiting for you to come back and you never did? Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do in a toxic relationship isn't to win the argument. It is to stop participating in the game. If you've ever found yourself chasing someone who kept pulling away, pause here for a moment. Ask yourself, was I fighting for the relationship or was I fighting to finally receive the treatment I should have been receiving all along? If that question hits home, share this message with someone who needs to hear it. Because sometimes another person's silence isn't rejection. Sometimes it's the beginning of your freedom. One of the most revealing moments in a toxic relationship can come when the narcissistic person pulls away and quietly waits for you to chase them. They may stop responding, become emotionally distant, withdraw affection, or suddenly act as though you are the problem. And underneath that silence, there can be an expectation that eventually you will break, that you will call, that you will send another message, that you will apologize even when you did nothing wrong, that you will beg them to come back. Why would someone expect that? Because patterns teach people what to expect. If every time they withdrew, you rushed toward them, they may have learned that distance gives them power. Their silence creates anxiety, your anxiety creates pursuit, and your pursuit reassures them that they still have emotional influence over you. But then something changes. This time, you don't chase. You don't send the long paragraph explaining your feelings. You don't repeatedly ask what went wrong. You don't try to convince them that you love them. You don't beg for another chance. And that can be deeply uncomfortable, not necessarily because you have stopped caring, but because you are breaking a pattern that once controlled your behavior. You may still miss them. You may still feel confused. You may still wake up wondering whether they will contact you. But you begin to understand that missing someone doesn't mean you have to return to them. The person waiting for you to beg may have expected your emotional reaction to restore their sense of control. But when you refuse to participate, the old pattern loses its power. Your silence isn't about winning. It isn't revenge. It isn't about making them suffer. It is simply the moment you decide that your dignity is not something you have to surrender just to keep another person from walking away. They waited for you to beg, and you finally realized you didn't have to. When you stop chasing someone who expected you to chase them, something important happens. The power dynamic begins to change. Not because you suddenly become more powerful than them, but because you stop giving your emotional energy to a pattern that was keeping you trapped. For a person accustomed to controlling the rhythm of a relationship through withdrawal, silence, coldness, or sudden distance, your refusal to pursue can be unexpected. They may have been used to seeing you react. When they became distant, you reached out. When they ignored you, you asked what was wrong. When they threatened to leave, you tried to convince them to stay. Every reaction told them that their withdrawal still had an effect on you. Then one day, you don't react the way they expected. You don't chase. You don't plead. You don't send another message. You don't spend hours trying to explain yourself to someone who has already decided not to listen. And suddenly, the familiar pattern doesn't work anymore. This doesn't mean you have manipulated them back. It doesn't mean you have won some psychological battle. It means you have interrupted the cycle. That distinction matters. Because healing isn't about learning how to control the narcissistic person better. It is about learning that you don't have to participate in the control dynamic at all. You may still feel the urge to reach out. You may still wonder whether silence means the relationship is over. You may even fear that refusing to chase will make them leave permanently. But ask yourself something. If someone only stays when you beg them to stay, what kind of security did you really have? Real connection doesn't require you to constantly prove that you deserve someone's attention. Sometimes the most powerful boundary is not a dramatic confrontation. Sometimes it is simply refusing to chase someone who deliberately walked away. And when you stop chasing, you don't lose your power. You finally stop giving it away. Sometimes what looks like love is actually the desperate need to be reassured that you still matter to someone. In a narcissistic dynamic, this distinction can become incredibly difficult to recognize because the relationship may have trained you to constantly seek signs that everything is okay. When they become distant, you don't simply miss them. You start questioning yourself. Did I say something wrong? Are they angry? Have they stopped loving me? What can I do to make things normal again? And that is where begging can enter the picture. You may find yourself sending another message, explaining your feelings again, apologizing for things that weren't entirely your fault, or asking them not to leave. You may believe you're fighting for love, but sometimes underneath that behavior, You're actually fighting for reassurance. You want them to say, I still want you. You want them to prove that you're important. You want the anxiety to stop. And when they finally give you a little attention, the relief can feel enormous. For a moment, everything seems okay again. But if the pattern repeats, you can become dependent on those small moments of reassurance. This is why begging isn't necessarily evidence of deeper love. Sometimes it is evidence that someone has become emotionally destabilized by an unhealthy relationship pattern. Healthy love doesn't require you to repeatedly convince someone to choose you. Healthy love doesn't make affection feel like a reward you have to earn. And healthy connection doesn't leave you terrified that one wrong sentence will cause the entire relationship to disappear. The turning point comes when you recognize that reassurance from the person creating your insecurity cannot permanently heal the insecurity. You begin to tell yourself, I don't need to beg someone to prove that I matter. That doesn't mean you suddenly stop caring. It means you stop confusing desperation with devotion. You stop asking another person to give you the self-worth they were never supposed to control. And slowly, you realize that love should make room for your dignity, not demand that you surrender it. They may have mistaken your patience for dependence. They may have seen how many times you forgave, how many times you tried to understand, how many times you stayed when leaving would have been easier, and they may have drawn the wrong conclusion. They may have thought, they will always come back. They may have believed that because you love deeply, you could never walk away. But patience is not dependence. Being willing to work through problems does not mean you are incapable of living without someone. Giving another chance does not mean you have unlimited chances to give. And staying longer than you should have stayed does not mean you were weak. It may simply mean that you were hoping the person you loved would eventually meet you with the same effort you were giving them. This is where a toxic relationship can become especially confusing. You may have spent so much time proving that you were committed that the other person began to assume your commitment was guaranteed. They saw you return after conflict. They saw you forgive after disappointment. They saw you explain yourself after being misunderstood. They saw you continue trying even when you were emotionally exhausted. And because you kept showing up, they may have mistaken your willingness to repair the relationship for an inability to leave it. But eventually, something changes. You realize that patience has limits. You realize that understanding someone does not require you to excuse everything they do. You realize that forgiveness does not require continued access to you. And perhaps most importantly, you realize that loving someone does not obligate you to remain where you are repeatedly disrespected. That is when your patience becomes clarity. You stop thinking, how can I make this work? And you start asking, why am I the only one trying to make it work? That question can change everything. Because the moment you understand that your kindness was never proof that you needed them, you stop allowing someone to mistake your love for weakness. You were patient because you cared. You stayed because you hoped. But when you finally walked away, it wasn't because you had never loved them. It was because you finally learned to love yourself enough to stop proving it. When you stopped explaining yourself, something important happened. The manipulation began to lose its fuel. For a long time, you may have believed that if you could just explain your feelings clearly enough, the other person would finally understand. So you explained again and again. You described what hurt you, why it hurt you, and what you needed to change. You gave examples. You defended your intentions. You tried to make your words impossible to misunderstand. But sometimes the problem isn't that someone doesn't understand you. Sometimes they understand you perfectly well, but understanding you doesn't serve what they want. That realization can be painful. Because when someone repeatedly twists your words, dismisses your feelings, changes the subject, or turns your legitimate concerns back onto you, you may become trapped in an endless cycle of defending yourself. Every conversation becomes a courtroom. You are constantly presenting evidence, trying to prove that your feelings are valid. And the more you explain, the more material there can be for another argument. Eventually, you realize that you don't have to defend every emotion. You don't have to convince someone that their behavior hurt you before you are allowed to step away from it. You don't need their agreement to establish a boundary. You can simply say, this doesn't work for me anymore. And then stop explaining. That doesn't mean becoming cruel or refusing all communication. It means recognizing when communication has stopped being a genuine attempt to understand each other and has become a mechanism for keeping you engaged in conflict. Your emotional energy is valuable. Every argument doesn't deserve your participation. Every accusation doesn't require a defense. Every distortion doesn't require a 10-paragraph correction. Sometimes the healthiest response is not another explanation. It is distance. It is silence. It is refusing to enter the same circular conversation again. Because when you stop trying to convince someone who benefits from misunderstanding you, you take away something the unhealthy dynamic depended upon, your constant emotional engagement. You stop asking, how can I make them understand? And you start saying, I understand what I need to do. That is not weakness, that is clarity. And sometimes clarity is the beginning of freedom. Not responding is different from revenge, and understanding that difference can completely change the way you approach healing. When someone has hurt you repeatedly, it can be tempting to imagine that your silence will finally make them feel what you felt. You may want them to notice your absence, wonder where you are, regret what they did, or experience the same uncertainty they once created in you. Those feelings are understandable. But if your silence is still focused on getting a reaction from them, they are still occupying a significant amount of space in your mind. A boundary is different. A boundary says, I am no longer willing to participate in this pattern. It doesn't say, I will ignore you so that you suffer. It doesn't say, I want to make you jealous. It doesn't say, I'm going to disappear so you'll chase me. It says, this relationship dynamic is unhealthy for me, and I am choosing to step away. That distinction matters because revenge keeps you emotionally connected to the person you're trying to escape. You continue checking whether they noticed. You wonder whether they're hurting. You wait for a message. You analyze their social media. You imagine what they're thinking. You may have physically left the relationship while emotionally remaining trapped inside it. A genuine boundary moves in a different direction. You stop monitoring their reaction. You stop measuring your healing by whether they regret losing you. You stop asking whether your absence is affecting them. Instead, you begin asking whether your presence in your own life is changing. Are you sleeping better? Are you thinking more clearly? Are you reconnecting with yourself? Are you becoming less afraid of disappointing someone? Are you learning to trust your own decisions again? That is where the real transformation happens. Your silence doesn't need to be a weapon. It can simply be a door you close because you finally understand that walking through it again would take you back into the same cycle. You don't have to punish them. You don't have to teach them a lesson. You don't have to make them regret anything. You simply have to protect your peace. And sometimes the strongest boundary is the one you don't announce. You just live it. When you finally stop chasing, something about the relationship becomes easier to see. You begin to recognize that the relationship may have been less about mutual connection and more about what each person was receiving from the other. You were offering love, patience, understanding, forgiveness, attention, and emotional availability. But what happens when those things are constantly expected rather than appreciated? That question can be painful. Because you may have spent months or even years believing that the relationship was difficult simply because you loved deeply. You thought that if you tried harder, communicated better, became more patient, or gave more of yourself, things would eventually become stable. But if someone repeatedly makes you feel that you must earn basic affection, their behavior can reveal something important about the relationship. You were not simply being loved, you were being kept emotionally engaged. Your anxiety became part of the cycle. Their withdrawal created uncertainty. Your uncertainty made you seek reassurance. Your pursuit gave them evidence that they still had emotional influence over you. Then, when they offered a little attention, you felt relief. That relief could feel like love. But relief from anxiety is not the same thing as emotional safety. This is why the moment you stop begging can expose the transactional nature of the dynamic. If the connection only feels secure when you are chasing, apologizing, proving yourself, or accepting treatment that hurts you, then what you are protecting may not actually be a healthy relationship. You may have been protecting the possibility of finally getting the love you kept hoping would appear. And there is a profound difference between loving someone and being emotionally dependent on their approval. Once you recognize that, you begin to reclaim your perspective. You stop asking, how do I make them choose me? You start asking, why did I believe I had to convince someone to value me? You stop measuring love by how much pain you can tolerate. You start measuring relationships by respect, consistency, honesty, and emotional safety. And that is when the illusion begins to break. You realize that your willingness to stay was not proof that the relationship was healthy. Sometimes it was simply proof that you had been hoping for something that the relationship was never consistently giving you. And when you finally stop begging for it, you may discover that what you were desperately seeking from them was something you had the right to give yourself all along: dignity. When you finally stop chasing, something about the relationship becomes easier to see. You begin to recognize that the relationship may have been less about mutual connection and more about what each person was receiving from the other. You were offering love, patience, understanding, forgiveness, attention, and emotional availability. But what happens when those things are constantly expected rather than appreciated? That question can be painful, because you may have spent months or even years believing that the relationship was difficult simply because you loved deeply. You thought that if you tried harder, communicated better, became more patient, or gave more of yourself, things would eventually become stable. But if someone repeatedly makes you feel that you must earn basic affection, their behavior can reveal something important about the relationship. You were not simply being loved, you were being kept emotionally engaged. Your anxiety became part of the cycle. Their withdrawal created uncertainty. Your uncertainty made you seek reassurance. Your pursuit gave them evidence that they still had emotional influence over you. Then, when they offered a little attention, you felt relief. That relief could feel like love. But relief from anxiety is not the same thing as emotional safety. This is why the moment you stop begging can expose the transactional nature of the dynamic. If the connection only feels secure when you are chasing, apologizing, proving yourself, or accepting treatment that hurts you, then what you are protecting may not actually be a healthy relationship. You may have been protecting the possibility of finally getting the love you kept hoping would appear. And there is a profound difference between loving someone and being emotionally dependent on their approval. Once you recognize that, you begin to reclaim your perspective. You stop asking, how do I make them choose me? You start asking, why did I believe I had to convince someone to value me? You stop measuring love by how much pain you can tolerate. You start measuring relationships by respect, consistency, honesty, and emotional safety. And that is when the illusion begins to break. You realize that your willingness to stay was not proof that the relationship was healthy. Sometimes it was simply proof that you had been hoping for something that the relationship was never consistently giving you. And when you finally stop begging for it, you may discover that what you were desperately seeking from them was something you had the right to give yourself all along. Dignity. There comes a moment when you realize that refusing to beg was not about making the other person lose. It was about finally choosing yourself. Maybe for a long time you believed that your worth depended on whether someone stayed. When they pulled away, you felt rejected. When they became cold, you felt desperate to repair the connection. When they threatened to leave, you felt as though your entire emotional world was about to collapse. But eventually you begin to see things differently. You realize that your worth did not disappear when someone stopped giving you attention. Their silence did not make you less valuable. Their rejection did not define you. And their inability to appreciate you did not mean that you were unworthy of appreciation. That realization can be incredibly powerful. Because the narcissistic dynamic often leaves you focused on the other person's perception of you, you wonder what they think. You wonder whether they miss you. You wonder whether they regret losing you. You wonder whether they will come back. But healing begins when the questions change. Instead of asking, do they finally realize my value? You begin asking, do I realize my value? Instead of asking, will they choose me now? You ask, why am I still waiting to be chosen? Instead of wondering how to make them understand what they lost, you begin understanding what you almost lost in yourself. Your peace, your confidence, your voice. Your ability to trust your own judgment, your ability to say no without feeling guilty, and perhaps most importantly, your belief that you deserve relationships where love does not have to be begged for. You don't need to become cold to protect yourself. You don't need to stop caring. You don't need to hate the person who hurt you. You simply need to stop abandoning yourself in order to keep someone else. That is what your refusal to beg can represent. Not revenge, not pride, not a game, a boundary, a decision, a return to yourself. They may have expected you to break down and come running back, but you didn't. And somewhere between the silence, the loneliness, and the healing, you discovered something they could never give you, the permission to choose yourself. And once you truly choose yourself, you no longer need someone else to validate the decision. And maybe this is the part they never expected. They expected you to come back. They expected the silence to break you. They expected you to send one more message, make one more apology, ask one more time for their love. They waited for you to beg, but you never did. Not because you stopped caring overnight, not because you became cold, not because you wanted revenge. You simply reached the point where losing yourself hurt more than losing them. And that is where your power began. You stopped explaining. You stopped chasing. You stopped trying to convince someone of your worth. You stopped measuring your value by whether they chose you. And slowly, you understood something that can change your entire life. You were never asking for too much. You were asking the wrong person for the right things. You wanted consistency. You wanted respect. You wanted honesty. You wanted emotional safety. You wanted to be loved without having to earn it every single day. Those aren't unreasonable demands. Those are the foundations of a healthy relationship. So if they are still waiting for you to come back and beg, let them wait. You don't have to prove anything. You don't have to make them regret losing you. You don't even have to make them understand why you left. Your healing is not a performance for the person who hurt you. Your healing belongs to you. And one day, you may look back at the person who once had you begging for scraps of affection and realize something extraordinary. You didn't lose the love of your life. You lost the version of yourself that believed you had to beg to be loved. And you found something far more valuable in return. Your voice, your boundaries, your dignity, your peace, yourself. They waited for you to beg. You never did. And now you don't wait for them anymore.